This is A Conversation With, brought to you by the Conference Board's Human Capital Center.
Hi, this is Robin Erickson, and I'm a principal researcher at the Conference Board. Thanks so much for joining us today for our conversation with Anna Tavis, focused on the subject of performance management. Anna is a clinical associate professor of human capital management at NYU. She is a researcher, writer, speaker, global educator, and coach. Our topic today is very interesting, as many companies are struggling with what to do with performance management. It's been very clear that performance management is a process that's in flux. According to the Conference Board's research, only 32.9% of employees are satisfied with their performance review process, but this process is actually a very strong driver of job satisfaction. And this doesn't surprise us because, according to some Gallup research, only 14% of employees strongly agree that their performance reviews inspire them to improve. So it has been a long journey, and my first question for you, Anna, is why is it so hard for companies to figure out performance management?
Performance management is really the backbone of employees' life cycle and the whole purpose of why we are in the workplace. It's about performance, it's about delivery, it's about efficiency and effectiveness. And there are so many processes that are woven into the performance life cycle, as we call it, in HR. And that is why the complexity of the process itself makes it very difficult to figure out what the right solution for organizations is. The other aspect of performance management that is very challenging is that it is very connected to the business, actual business production or business cycle. And it is being managed by HR that traditionally has been sort of the administrative function, or at least it's been how it's historically evolved. So that disconnect between the agility and the challenges and the pivots in the business cycle and actually the management of each individual performance, that disconnect really was jarring when it came down to actual accurate evaluation of performance. So there were so many challenges, as I said, that had to do with the complexity of how this process has been set up historically in organizations, and the disconnect that historically, again, evolved with how HR that's been charged with managing the process been set up as a purely administrative back office function. That's what created that particular challenge in figuring out how you do performance management that is business aligned, responsive, adaptive, and actually meets both management and employees' expectations. Too much to ask, too little resources, and too many outcomes expected of this process.
So do you have any true success stories that you could share with our listeners?
Indeed. Early in the century, it really started with about 2008, 2009. Companies started to review how performance management was measured and how it was actually set up and designed. And a lot of it had to do with technology really significantly accelerating the business process on the business side. And at the time when especially technology companies were working in the agile way, performance management continued to be sort of the traditional annual process. And that disconnect triggered some of the most visionary and innovative HR organizations look at the process and say, we need to do something different. And that's what triggered the whole I would say the whole wave of innovative experiments in the performance management space that really started to occur in this century, and about, as I said, starting in 2008, 2010, and it's still ongoing. So there are some really good outcomes by now, but as you've mentioned, Robin, we're still in the process of discovering what actually is going to work in a sustainable and ongoing way.
So what are some of the key lessons that companies on this journey have learned?
The number one lesson I would say is the importance of simplifying what we do with performance management as opposed to performance. Number one question that came up was about reviewing what performance actually is before we get to the management of performance. And having this closer look at performance, revisiting the whole concept of performance in companies, what we found out is performance has changed. Therefore, how we measure performance needed to change. And number one priority for most companies was to simplify the way we manage performance. And clearly, and everyone I'm sure on this podcast is aware of the trend of dropping ratings, for example. That was one of the most radical solutions that companies arrived at, having looked at the complexity of what's built over the years on the management of performance side. And they decided just to rip out the old approach and get rid of ratings and sort of create a much more, autonomous process, and started experimenting with this, with performance management in their own space. So as I said, some experiments were run around dropping the ratings. That was the signature of a more simplified process. What I would say about that, and we can get more into details later, that it was just one of the steps and not necessarily the universally accepted one. But that's where a lot of companies first rush to in the kind of the first swing of this pendulum that moves back and forth around performance management. So by dropping the ratings, the assumption was made that it will become a much more easier process to execute. And then all the consequences of that started to show up, and different solutions were offered to address those issues. For example, the question of decoupling, again, in the spirit of simplification, compensation and performance management, which was probably and still remains to be one of the most difficult areas for any innovation in the performance management space. It's making that decision between compensation and performance. Other areas that were reviewed and revised in some of the companies, again in the spirit of simplification, is separating out the accountability part of performance management, let's say identifying performance and poor performers, and the development part of performance management. Again, simplification, peeling the onion. Can we actually do this separately? Can we develop people on one track and then hold them accountable on another? The way it was accomplished was through creating the much more frequent touch points across performance management life cycle, and that is moving away from the annual performance evaluation to the more frequent quarterly in most cases, and in some cases even weekly, and in some extreme cases in a daily touch points with the employees on their performance. And the last third important milestone in this simplification attempt and trend is also getting away from the kind of the bell curve, the differentiation exercise that companies looked at in considering their talent pool and the talent management area, and moving away from one single point of decision on that particular bell curve, which was the manager. So what companies started to look at is, could we actually take the pulse of the performance throughout the performance process, not just the annual final review and meeting of goals? And could there be multiple feeds into this evaluation process, like, for example, in the 360 framework? So in summary, again, I want to repeat that all of these experiments were run in the spirit of simplification and closing this gap between what was actually happening on the work side of performance and how measurement and management of performance was handled.
Wow, that's quite an impressive rundown of everything that's been happening. I hadn't realized where the rating list system had come from, that it was really a search for simplification. So, given how much you've studied this topic and the research that you've done, where would you recommend that companies start if they want to go down this path of transforming their performance management system? What would your recommendations be for where they should get started?
That's such an excellent question. Number one decision point should be to really slow down. And as most companies, what they try to do in the traditional way is do benchmarking and look at what everyone else is doing. And that's not necessarily the right place to start. It's always good to see where the trends go and how others are solving for their issues. But what we've seen in this particular century, starting with performance management revolution, as Peter Capelli and myself call it in our article in HBR, is to really look inside and see, what is the business case? What is happening in our own business? We are out of the best practice exercise in HR. We need to be able to make decisions based on evidence that's coming from within our own business organization. And so as we might be looking and educating ourselves on all of the different experiments that are going on and different formats that are emerging, the priority should be looking at inside the organization, understanding what's driving the business now, looking very closely at how performance actually happens in the workplace. What is performance for our business? Is it agile? Is it waterfall? Is innovation our strategy and goal, or are we in more sustaining the business model that we've and operationalizing the business that we've already been successfully running for a few years? So really making that very specific decision to your own business. Second step I would suggest is really looking at employee experience. I know that we talk a lot about employee experience, and that kind of focus came a lot later in this whole HR renewal wave that we're living through right now, long after performance management started to be, disassembled and unbundled and looked at. But this whole employee experience perspective, and that is not necessarily going directly to the management and finding out what management wants, but also knowing very clearly about what employees actually experience and how to make it more humane and more aligned with the employee experience in the workplace. So, number one, looking at the business you are in, the way people are working objectively, and also understanding what employee experience is. And then clearly getting some ideas and research that's out there, but not just limiting yourself to the practices, but also digging into some academic research, for example, on the importance of goals or the role of feedback, and kind of getting the overall HR education around, what's involved in the performance management process. And then kind of being very clear, again, of the specifics of your organization, where your organizational needs are, where the strategy is pointing out, and what your specific organizational culture is from the employee experience perspective. So, unlike what we've done before, mostly looking at what GE has done with their 9 boxes and other management practices, people management practices, and kind of importing them in, parachuting them in. This is more a process from the inside out. And if I could just throw in a really good illustration of how this happens in companies that kind of figured it out for themselves and are very confident in what they've developed. I will take, for example, IBM, which is my favorite example. I've done quite a bit of work with IBM myself, and most recently collaborated with MIT on writing a business case on digital transformation of performance management at IBM. But there, Diane Gerson, who is the head of HR for IBM, that's exactly what she did. She looked inside the company, and she actually went to the employees to ask them first the question about what's not working on the performance management side. And surprisingly, they got a lot of feedback from the employees. To your introduction, Robin, in the beginning, it was very clear from engagement surveys and other sources. We already knew that employees didn't really particularly care much about performance appraisals. But, to gather that granular feedback from employees was very important for Diane Gerson at IBM. And I think based on those data, then she started charting her new performance management pathway. And their decision in the end, just to run, the story to its successful conclusion, they decided to go agile on performance management, and that is not wait until the center designs, HR designs the new performance management process and rolls it out to the employees and does the change management and communication, but instead develop a prototype, MVP, minimal viable product, put it out there and see what the feedback from employees was going to be, whether it was working or not. For example, on the ratings, they tried a couple of parallel experiments. In one experiment, they tried to do it with ratings. The other was without ratings, and see what came back. And what came back for IBM is the ratings. The engineers actually appreciated ratings. So there's no point of follow Accenture, for example, in a consulting business that ripped out their rating system and is very happy about it because they have a very different culture and different way of evaluating what their employees were doing. So the successful scenario of this kind of independent and self-sufficient in looking on your particular organization, your specific business case, and running with it would be for me these 2 examples of IBM that went out, asked about their employees what they wanted, and kept the ratings, and Accenture with consultants, a lot of autonomy, a lot of different projects, no ratings, and they're happy with that. So these are just 2 examples to illustrate what I think is really important.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing those examples. I was going to ask you about the employees because anecdotally, I think most employees think performance management is a nightmare, and so often, the process is changed on a yearly or every couple of years, on a yearly basis or every couple of years, and it's just really hard for employees to take anything positive away from it. So I love your suggestions and your examples of those 2 companies. But so you've given us your recommendations on where to start. What do you think the roadblocks would be to successfully implementing a performance management system that would work well within an organization?
I think one of the challenges for companies to really go in that direction that I recommend, sort of self-sufficiency, autonomy, and looking inside and really developing this authentic performance approach, would be the culture and even the HR organization. What I'm finding working with a number of companies and having conversations with the senior HR leaders is HR has traditionally not been trained to do this type of independent work. We were very good at looking at what everyone else was doing and kind of distilling it for ourselves, inviting consultants oftentimes, and then rolling things out, but not independently doing experiments, doing research, proving, hypotheses, looking at data, working with analytics independently. So I think a number one challenge would be, to really upskill ourselves, the HR organization, if we were to continue to be the stewards of performance management process. And if I could do an illustration again, knowing the IBM case so well, Diane Gerson retrained, put in a lot of effort into retraining her employees, bringing in people from other functions, IT and marketing and communications, and blending them into the more traditional HR function. And all of IBM HR have been trained on design thinking, for example. If you're going to take employee experience and put it in the center of what you're developing for your performance management system, it's a lot of work, and design thinking is the process that, helps you bring that insight from employees into the design process. So that particular skill set, as an illustration, was brought into the organization. So what I would say, one of the barriers will be just the new skill sets that we need to acquire to be able to, first of all, generate that new design, and secondly, implement it in the right way with the employees on the inside of the design process.
I really like that, because it's I love that you're talking about design thinking, because it's a skill set and a mindset shift, right? There almost needs to be a cultural transformation as well to do this well, I think.
Absolutely. Can't agree more.
Yes, we're in violent agreement here. So, Anna, what do you think the future of performance management will be?
There are lots of scenarios for the future for performance management. The number one decision that we need to still make in organizations is, that tension between accountability and development. So it's the number one priority kind of decision, because anytime you talk about this kind of much more free-flowing, no ratings and type of autonomous environment, the question will come from your employee relations department around, so how are we dealing with non-performance, et cetera, et cetera. And in some ways, it's an easy decision. Once you separate those out, you have a lot more options for yourself in how those designs, the new designs, are going to evolve. And I would say that the future is definitely on the side of development rather than accountability, because for centuries it was about accountability more than about development. So the development is going to happen through ongoing, continuing feedback. And that's where I see a lot of innovation is happening. How do we deliver that feedback? Before, it was a pretty linear process. It's the manager delivering feedback to the employees at the end of the year. And a lot of times it was just a pro forma exercise. What we're seeing now in these best designs, the new innovative decisions and bold decisions that organizations make about performance management, is introducing these developmental feedback-based touch points in strategic moments that matter across the performance life cycle. And I specifically say not necessarily the exact timing, once a month, quarterly, twice a year, whatever, but it's about moments that matter. And in different organizations, those moments are going to occur at different rate of frequency, for example. So I think that, again, this personalization of the process, bringing important feedback that drives toward development and improvement, along the way at the right time in the right place is where the opportunities are for developing a much more adaptive and much more performance-focused rather than appraisal-focused system. So again, technology is going to play a big role there. Managers are going to get a lot of assistance if managers will continue to be the primary kind of feedback providers to the employees, and that will happen through AI. It will happen through various, analytics that will be available to the managers, et cetera. As well as, building communities, developing opportunities for peer feedback along the way, and kind of creating a much more, fluid, changing environment where decisions could be made at the point where it matters in the business rather than, again, hierarchical cascades and waiting for the schedules for these types of conversations to occur. So the future is with development, the future is with feedback, the future is with making incremental adjustments so that we're not, faced with a big blow up at the end of the year or goals unmet. And the future will be in this continuous improvement, continuous development enabled through technology, more kind of human aligned and emotionally sensitive technology that will be serving us well in the workplace.
Wow. Well, I'm so glad that you went there. I'm so glad that you were able to think about, the technology and the training that's going to be needed, and just, looking for organizations to think about incremental changes to their process. And so thank you so much. I've learned so much from listening to you today, Anna. And thank you to our listeners as well. If you enjoyed today's podcast, go to conference-board.org/podcasts to sign up for our series of podcasts on many different topics. I'm Robin Erickson for the Conference Board. Have a great day.
This has been A Conversation With, brought to you by the Conference Board's Human Capital Center.